Good afternoon, hello, and welcome to this review for The Faith of Beasts, Second in the Captives' War by James S.A. Corey. Specifically, this is a review for the audiobook, which is narrated by Jefferson Mays. Spectacular job by Jefferson Mays, can I just say. So because it's an audio, I don't have a book to wave around, but I do have this spectacular reading journal in which I've made notes. So this is here. If I'm looking down, that's mostly what I'm looking at. James S.A. Corey is, of course, a pen name used by collaborators Daniel Abrams and Ty Frank. They wrote the science fiction series The Expanse. Pardon that's happening. It's an afternoon and it's a very bright afternoon. Sun is rushing through. Can't be bothered to block it out. Plus I like sun. Okay, they wrote The Expanse. I loved The Expanse, the series. I tried to read the books that didn't work for me. However, not that long ago, really, I picked up The Mercy of Gods. When did I read The Mercy of Gods? It was in November last year. So November 2025. I came across The Mercy of Gods when I was looking for an audiobook from my library, and I started it and I actually quite liked it. So The Captives' War is completely different from The Expanse, which I didn't bond with, either in audio in real life. But The Captives' War I did. Now, so because I was listening to an audio, I've got this different spelling or pronunciation in my head for a lot of things. So there's some variation. So in the first book, which I read in November, you've got a big build-up on a planet Asian. Now, the narrator says it in a way that sounds like it is Asian, almost like Azure. But when you see it spelt, it's Anjiin, which I would have pronounced Anjin, but pronunciations may vary, right? So we start with humanity on the planet Asian, and I'll go with Mays's pronunciation for that one, because I'm used to it by now. And we're introduced to a whole lot of characters, and then the world is invaded by the Carracks. Now, the Carracks, from the way they're described, they sound to me a bit like a crayfish or a lobster. They've got fighting arms, they've got small manipulator arms. They've got an abdomen and a large number of legs. I don't know if that's how James S.A. Corey visualized the Carracks, but that's how I visualize the Carracks, especially since they've got variable numbers of eyes, and the colors of their clades and functions vary and can change within an individual over their lifetime. So anyway, in that original book, The Mercy of Gods, we're introduced to Daffod Alcor and the team of scientists that he's working at. They are mostly scooped up with the rest of Asian who aren't killed outright, because the Carracks kill 1/8 of any population planet that they are conquering outright. They're scooped up and dragged off to the Carracks' homeworld. What do they call it? The Palace, the Empire of Palace? Homeworld. Never mind. World Empire? World Palace. Something like that. And we follow them as they go through this difficult adjustment from being free, independent people, top of their game, to being essentially less than slaves. They're considered beasts by the Carracks. All species other than Carracks to them are animals. And there are a lot of aliens. This is the series for someone who wants lots of aliens. Anyhow, going back to The Mercy of Gods, I can see from my review that I liked it, but I wasn't crazy about it. I only gave it 3 stars. I didn't initially like or bond with any of the characters. By about 80%, I did quite like Daffod Alcor as a main character, and there were a lot of different plots. However, I enjoyed it well enough that I sort of flagged it in my head. I was a little bit annoyed that it wasn't instantly available. The Captives' War series was announced in 2018 as a trilogy, and Mercy of Gods came out in 2024, but The Faith of Beasts only came out in this year, 2026. Apparently both full novels became New York Times bestsellers. Random fact from the internet there. Now, there's a television adaptation apparently as well, which will affect me not at all since I don't have a television and watch almost nothing. However, back to the second in the series, The Faith of Beasts. I really liked it. So you often have in a trilogy, the second book suffers from middle book syndrome. It doesn't really know where it's going. It doesn't really know what it's doing. It's not as great as the first one that sucked you in. And no opinion can be held just yet about the third one, which isn't even on the horizon as far as I know. And I'm a bit bitter about that. If the third one was available, I'd be right there right now. I really like The Faith of Beasts. I feel like the first novel was all setting up for the good stuff that happened in this novel. And there was some fantastic stuff. Now, if you haven't read the first one, you can't possibly, I don't believe, understand The Faith of Beasts. These days, it's rare to find people reading things out of sequence because the internet lets you know what the sequence is and gives you availability that never used to exist when I was young. However, younger? I'm still young, right? My joints say otherwise. Anyhow, in the 80s or the 90s, it was more difficult to figure out where series was, and it was far more difficult to get the individual books that had been published a while back. Now you can do that. Hooray! Great for us readers. So if you haven't read The Mercy of Gods, you should go off and read that, because I'm going to be spoilering The Faith of Beasts, and The Faith of Beasts itself can do nothing but spoiler The Mercy of Gods. So go off and read that. But for us who are still here, or if you're not going to read it at all or for years, maybe stay and make the algorithm happy. So The Faith of Beasts starts on the World Palace. And we are starting to understand the magnitude of the Carrick's Empire. And we're starting to actually put in place all the different individual alien species that are interacting with humanity and which are of impact on the plot. So you've got things like the soft Lothar, which are fighting type beasts, and we start to realize that essentially every species that isn't a Carrick's is an animal, and an animal can either be useful or not, and the Carrick's basically don't care really about mortality of animals or of whole species. So they dump their client species in situations like the World Palace, and if they survive to become of use, then they survive to become of use, but if not, they will be eradicated. And Daffod Alcor as a character definitely came into his own in the first book when he realized what was happening. So Daffod became an interesting character toward the end of that book because he was the only one who was actually trying to figure out what things were. And James S.A. Corey threw us a complete curveball with this World Palace. We barely knew more than the individuals there knew. They were confused, they were threatened, they were at sea, they had no idea, and we didn't either. Daffod Alcor is that anchor man who finds out and through whom we find out. The others are trying to survive, he's trying to figure out, and he's walking around the palace and he's looking at other species. And it's through his observation that we realize that the Carrick's will eliminate a whole species without even thinking about it twice. Their ruthlessness is something that he understands, and he ends up understanding that if human animals become too difficult, or they rebel, or any of 100 things that aren't going to be of use to the Carrick's will eliminate humanity like that. And so he makes a deal. He contacts the librarian of the human moiety and starts to make deals and negotiate for a better position for humanity. And the human survivors hate him for it. In this, the second book, The Faith of Beasts, Alcor becomes more and more isolated. He's the one that goes to talk to the librarian, and everyone blames him for everything bad that's happening. They see him as collaborating with the enemy. The majority of them are totally incapable of understanding that without Daffod, they would probably already be dead. The whole species of humanity would be dead in the World Palace. But instead, he organizes things. he makes it so that the individual laboratories that are doing different things, such as protein analysis and production and algae for food, all of these are being constantly reported to the librarian to show how the human moiety is surviving. Now, in this book, a lot happens. These aren't small books. These are pretty chunky books. Because I listened to it, I think it was 14 hours. No, it's more than that. It was a lot. It was a big book. And because there's so much in it, it's kind of hard to review. But it's good science fiction in that it's got different types of science. So you've got the biology science, which is always going to do it for me. You've got the different alien species. You've got David Alcor, even though he is establishing the human moiety within the Carrick's empire, he loathes the Carricks perhaps more than anyone else. And his long-term plan is to bring them down. Now, to do that, he's doing a number of things. More spoilers if you haven't read this one. Probably stop now, if you have read the first one. But some of the things that we know from the first one is that the swarm exists. The swarm are a spy, and they think of them as a swarm, maybe like bees from the Tchaikovsky Dogs of War series, only they weren't aware until they infested the first person. Once they infested or infected or infiltrated the first person, that person died, but their entire personality, knowledge, and background and experience is available to the swarm living in their body. When the swarm leaves that person was dead, and they move to the next one, and then they incorporate their personality and all their knowledge. So the swarm is this ongoing thing. Now, in the first book, we saw how Dufford, who had been yearning... He'd been part of a research group, but he'd only got into there by the influence of his aunt. He is a scientist, but he was a very low-level scientist, so he's described in a rather demeaning way by his team leader, the guy who cleans up the glassware after the research is done. That was Tonna Fries. He was brilliant. He was head of the organization on the world of Asian, and what he was doing was he was consolidating the two different types of life forms on there. One was DNA based like us, and oak trees are mentioned, and maybe poplars and pines, I don't know, pear trees definitely. And then there was another that was a crystalline, and the two types of genetic or inheritance detail, because one's genetic, the other I think was crystalline, had never been able to be merged in any way. But Tonna Fries' group had managed to make those first steps. That was perhaps one of my favourite things about the Mercy of Gods, and we didn't go into it enough to really satisfy me. But carrying on from that, the person who's reading the Mercy of Gods, it's very obvious that to them that the humans of Asian are humans. They are us. No mention of Earth is made. Earth is apparently a completely lost planet. And they kind of know they aren't native to Asian, but then again, do they really? It seems to be not something they really worry about as much as merging the two different inheritance strands. Now, Tonna Fries started up a laboratory for merging two different discordant types of genetic material. Once they were kidnapped by the Carricks in the World Palace. Then we had this simian type race that broke into the lab, smashed everything. And we had another member of the research team, Jefferson, who went semi-ballistic, full war leader, and marched out to take down these simians. So you've got character development, you've got character evolution, you've got character kaboom with Jefferson and some of the others. Jefferson continues into the Faith of Beasts, and in this book, the Carricks have actually scooped up a whole lot of humans and sent them off in ships to find out what they're good for in different research situations. Now, Jefferson gets sent to this other planet where they're recording a whole heap of data about the people who lived there before the Carricks smashed them. And we find out that the Carricks have been going through an eternal war against the deathless enemy, and the deathless enemy had been on this planet. So Jessum's carefully researching in the pear orchard when she discovers that the pear orchard is actually pears. pairs that are genetically identical to the same types of fruit that they had on Agian. And then a whole heap of other things fall into place. The dwellings that looked like they would fit humans, the writing that looked like it could be human. All these things could be human because they were, because humans were on this planet. And the conclusion that we and Jessen get is that humans are actually the deathless enemy. Are they or not? At the end of this book, we're left uncertain. Wait for the next installment. Now, Jessen and another Goral was his name, another researcher on the same team that we didn't know from the first book, he's an archaeologist, they actually made contact with a small group that had escaped from that civilization when the Carracks had crushed it. And some fascinating information there, not only the DNA stuff, not only a whole heap of other things, way too much to go into, but we find out that there are still people fighting the Carracks, and they include humans. So Goral goes off with those humans, and Jessen comes back to the World Palace and lets Dafydd Alcor know that. Now, in the meantime, while she's been gone, a few things have happened. One of them was one of my favourite bits in this book, where Tonna Fries, who is an asshole, is he crushed by a Carracks? No, I think it's one of their warrior species. It sounds a bit like a hound dog that walks on a whole heap of sharpened knives. Was that the Lothark? No, it wasn't the Lothark. I can't remember. There's a lot of alien species in here. Anyhow, Tonna Fries got killed. I was really happy about that. If there was any character that I truly despised from the first book, it wasn't the spy, it wasn't Dafydd Alcor, it was Tonna Fries. Once he was gone, a whole lot of other things happened in a domino effect, because the Carracks have basically told Dafydd that the human population, the World Palace, has to be self-sustaining. They want kids. Most of the people they scooped off in Ashley were top of their game, and thus they weren't really of childbearing age overall. So they've invented this cunning plan to clone a whole heap of babies, grow them in sacks, so in vitro fertilization of eggs and growing them artificially, and then basically birthing them out of the sacks. Fascinating project. A whole lot of different stuff happens around that, and it was quite fascinating. Then you've got other characters. You've got the whole story arc of the Swarm. The Swarm actually was inhabiting... Now, what is her name? I never read it, so I don't know. The way Mays says her name, it sounds like Elsianan. I think it is meant to be Else, or Elise, or something like that, but still not sure about that. Anyhow, the Swarm was in her, and Dafydd was partnered with her during that time without realizing that it wasn't the Elsianan, it was an actual alien spy machine. But the spy machine since revealed itself to Dafydd while he was inhabiting Jessen's brother, who is of course now dead, because anything that the Swarm inhabits becomes dead. Once Dafydd and the Swarm have a ambiguous relationship. Both want to take down the Carracks, and so Dafydd is definitely on board with that. But he isn't on board with the Swarm wanting a physical relationship with him, and that's a whole nother kettle of fish that we shouldn't get into. But man, is it fascinating. It was really interesting to read. A bit wobbly at times, but overall good. And the Swarm, which was smuggled into the Carracks' World Palace with human slaves, has got all this information and finds a really gory way to get it out into the universe, which I'm not going to spoil. You should find that out. Anyhow, Jessamine comes back from the field. She can't find her brother. Her brother is off on a secret mission, says Dafydd. But what's really happened is the Swarm has redesigned the body into another woman called Clay. It likes being a woman better than being a man, and essentially now it's its own individual person, no longer inhabiting other people's bodies, but inhabiting its own as itself. So that's something that Jessamine's going to learn. Jessamine is an interesting character because she has a chemical imbalance that leads to depression, and which she has to manage with drugs. And of course, once they got to the World Palace, she didn't have access to the medications she'd always relied on. So, fascinating character that she is. The Swarm's created this character of Clay, another interesting character, and because it's got all the information that Elsianan had, the Swarm knows how to manage a biological laboratory and is now working where Tonna Fries used to. There's so much more, but let's talk in brief about another plot. One of the few other characters from the original research group is one I really liked and whose name I'm trying to remember without much success. Anyhow, he's one of the most likable of the original research team. He is a person who's attracted to other men, but has not ever had a really strongly bonded relationship with one. He seems to be more of a playing the field kind of guy. He bonds with another man. He's been sent out on one of the Carrick ships to find out what they're good for. And this particular ship is in any number of battles. And the way S.A. Corey have written the space battles and the type of weapons that the enemy and the Carricks use against each other in space is fascinating. And the Carricks actually use a whole species that sound a bit like a crane or an ibis as a detector. They are better than any mechanical way of detecting when an incoming attack is happening, and they sing. This book is solid with these fascinating concepts and references. It's just throughout. More than I could even talk to if I wanted to. Anyhow, the two of them bond with an alien that is basically a giant slug. What this slug is all about is information and knowing stuff, and it scoops up the two humans because we've got nice useful digits that it can use to open doors and things, and takes them on a research mission onto a derelict spaceship that had been left together behind by the deathless enemy. And on there's a number of species once again, and what is his name? Damn, I'm going to have to look up this name. Not easy to look things up on audiobooks. Anyhow, this guy who I really quite like, what is his name? Breep. Wasn't Breep. Anyhow, he's taking biological samples from anything that he finds on this ruined ship, and he and we slowly become certain that some of them are human. So we've got this information coming from a whole different type of directions, that humans may be the deathless enemy, or at least they're associated with the deathless enemy, which is really pretty cool when you think about it. Now, Space Slug is a great alien. We don't really get to bond too much with aliens in the first book, but in this one, Giant Slug, forgotten his name. I forget everything, and I didn't write it down, unfortunately. The end of the Faith of Beasts is a weird sort of ending. Hang on. Is this a thing that can happen? Is that better? I think that's better. I can see what I've written at least. So, the end of Faith of Beasts is really interesting in that it manages not to be entirely it's a cliffhanger. Obviously, it's going to be continued into the next book. Obviously, we're going to learn so much more in the next book. But after spending about a third of this book building up the expectations that humans may be the deathless enemy, at the end of it, the Swarm offers an alternative options that they're not the deathless enemy, but maybe the deathless enemy is more than just a species. Fascinating concept. Once again, we're going into biology there. Interesting, speculative biology, and I love that. The other thing that happens towards the end of it is a bit of an overturn of Daffod Alcor's plans. He's been thinking the Carricks are ruled by a single sovereign. The entire empire of the Carricks, all the hundreds of worlds, all the many battles throughout, the information is brought back to the sovereign, a single sovereign who rules everything. So his concept is, well, if we take out the sovereign, we've taken out the Carricks empire. He learns that that is not so. And so his plan so far has a setback. And in the third book, when it comes out, we will be seeing where he goes from there. I don't know when the next book will come out. I don't know that I've even seen anything online about what its title is or when we can expect it. The Mercy of Gods was released in 24 and Faith of Beasts came out in 26. So I suppose we're looking at 2028 maybe for the next one. I think I'll be there for it as soon as it comes out, because it's really quite unusual to have a trilogy where the second book is even better than the first one and draws you in entirely. Which is very much what I feel that the Faith of Beasts did. So yes, great book. If you read the first one, definitely go on to the second one. If you read the first one, finished it, but weren't too impressed, you may find yourself more impressed by the second, as I was. If you are starting to like Dafydd Alcor as a sort of anchor character by the end of The Mercy of Gods, the Faith of Beasts expands him and his plans and his world significantly. And if you felt like at the end of the first one you were just starting to find your feet in the world palace and understand the empire of the Carracks, then the Faith of Beasts takes that all the more forward, until by the end of it you actually feel like you've got a bit of a grip on the way the Carracks empire works and how the world palace works. Which means I expect that the third one is going to totally and utterly revolve the world upside down, because that's kind of what they did between the first and second book. Anyway, I've got to say, I think it's a greatly conceived, very well written, fascinating book with some great, great concepts. Once again, this is a series that reassures me that modern science fiction doesn't always have to be worse than the old golden age pulp science fiction that I generally read. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope I have given you a level of intrigue, at least, with the Captive War, because it does deserve intrigue. And I think James S.A. Corey is famous enough that they don't need any particular help from me. But, yeah, I'd endorse this book. And you should read good books too. Thanks for watching.